Dear friends, may I ask you to please take your seat, and we will begin. Welcome to what promises to be an interesting and important lecture this evening. In a published article last month, the British historian Daniel Johnson wrote as follows. I quote him, "Europe is in the grip of a rage that threatens to destroy everything it stands for, but which it does not understand. That rage comes from the far left and the far right, from Muslims and Christians, from town and country. It is a ghost from the past and a harbinger of the future. It is anti-Semitism. Unless it is exorcised, it will destroy us." To understand the escalating hostility in Europe described in these chilling words is precisely the aim of this evening's lecture. As you will soon hear, our speaker, Katharina von Schnurbein, is superbly well equipped to help us grasp the nature of present-day anti-Semitism in Europe and the threats it poses. She will also enlighten us about what is being done to effectively counter these threats. Michael McRobbie, the president of Indiana University, will introduce her, but before calling him to the podium, I feel moved to say just a few words about President McRobbie's own position with respect to the gravity of the matters before us. They are not confined to Europe alone. As we all know, especially since the massacre of Jews at prayer in the Pittsburgh synagogue this past October, America is not immune. In such a time, what is needed is intelligent, responsible, and effective leadership. Fortunately for us, President McRobbie has done much to provide it. In both principled and practical ways, President McRobbie has been consistently forthright in his public recognition and condemnation of anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred whenever they occur. They take a variety of forms. As far back as 2007, for instance, he was among the very first of American university presidents to denounce calls for boycotts against Israel, which he recognized are not only antithetical to academic freedom, but also alarmingly similar in tone and content to anti-Semitic attitudes that have plagued the world for generations. He has remained steadfast in his stand against such abhorrent actions as he has against all other forms of blatant and destructive prejudice. In short, and at a time when universities elsewhere in this country have become tense and fractious institutions, President McRobbie has set a tone for Indiana University that has maintained it as the wholesome, tolerant, and welcome community of scholars and students that it is. For his exemplary leadership in unambiguously opposing hateful words and deeds directed against Jews and others, he was recognized in 2014 with the Anti-Defamation League's Man of Achievement Award. As a longtime faculty member of this outstanding institution, which he has guided wisely and humanely for almost a dozen years now, I'm proud and pleased to call up President Michael McRobbie, who will add his own words of welcome to you and introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Alvin, for those very kind and generous words, which I appreciate very much. I'd like to welcome all of those who have joined us for tonight's remarks by Katharina von Schnurbein, who will deliver the keynote remarks for the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism's conference, Contending with Anti-Semitism in a Rapidly Changing Political Climate. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I want to take a moment to make a special announcement. I'm very pleased to announce this evening that Professor Alvin Rosenfeld, who of course directs the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, and was also the founder and former long-time director of IU's Born's Jewish Studies program, has generously endowed the Erna B. Rosenfeld Professorship in the Born's Jewish Studies program in memory of his late wife. This will be the first endowed professorship with a focus on the study of contemporary anti-Semitism at any university in the United States. Erna Rosenfeld, Alvin's wife of 50 years, who my wife Laurie and I had the pleasure of knowing, worked for Indiana University for more than 35 years, receiving the Outstanding Professional Staff Merit Award for her work as the area coordinator for IU Residence Life. And a search to fill this professorship is currently underway. When filled, this professorship will allow Indiana University to maintain its leading position in the study of contemporary anti-Semitism in the United States. So, once again, maybe you can join me in thanking Professor Rosenfeld for his generosity. And now it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's keynote speaker, Katharina von Schnurbein. She has a rich educational background. We were just discussing it over dinner, actually. Undergraduate studies at the University of Bonn, Master of Slavonic Studies from Oxford University, a Master of European Studies from the Center for European Integration Studies in Bonn. And I think you said a period at the University of Missouri as an exchange scholar as well, so a very broad portfolio of educational institutions as well. As those affiliated with Indiana University will know, I'm very fond of pointing out that Indiana University teaches around 70 foreign languages, more than any other university in the United States. And the vast majority of this language instruction takes place in the Hamilton Luber School of Global and International Studies, which is also home to the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, and the Dean of the school is with us here tonight as well. Our multilingual keynote speaker will feel right at home in many of these classrooms as she speaks German, English, Czech, Dutch, and French, and apparently is studying Hebrew and Italian. And these are all languages that Indiana University offers, by the way. In December of 2015, intent on combating all forms of racism, hatred, and intolerance with the same determination, the European Commission announced that it would appoint 2 new coordinators, one to combat anti-Muslim hatred in the European Union member states, and one to combat anti-Semitism. Ms. von Schnurbein, who had at that point served with the Commission in various roles for more than a decade, was appointed as the Commission's first coordinator on combating anti-Semitism. In this role, she worked towards the ultimate goal of normality for Jews in Europe, so that they do not have to second-guess their movements and everyday decisions in order to enjoy their basic rights and freedoms. Ms. von Schnurbein previously served the European Commission as press officer for the EU delegation in Prague, as the spokesperson for the Employment, Social Affairs and Equal Opportunities Office in Brussels, and as an advisor to EU Commission President Jose Manuel Barroso. In the latter role, she coordinated the Commission's dialogue with churches, religious associations, and philosophical and non-confessional organisations. As the European Commission's coordinator on combating anti-Semitism, Ms. von Schnurbein brings the concerns of Jewish communities in the EU member states to the attention of the political level of the Commission. She helps coordinate efforts across services in the context of the Commission's overarching policy on racism, xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance. She serves as a liaison with the 28 EU member states, the European Parliament, and other institutions and civil society organisations. She has worked to rally European Union member nations to adopt the working definition of anti-Semitism as set out by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Ms. von Schnurbein collaborated closely with leaders of the IHRA as they worked to develop a clear definition, and her advocacy efforts helped lead to the European Parliament's adoption in 2017 of its first ever resolution on combating anti-Semitism, which included this working definition. She also works to help enforce Europe's ban on Holocaust denial and to facilitate the removal of content flagged as hate speech from European social media sites. In January, she and her colleagues released a Eurobarometer survey on anti-Semitism, which highlighted a major division on the perception of anti-Semitism in the EU. While nearly 90% of Jews responded that anti-Semitism had increased significantly over the last 5 years, only 36% of the general public believes that it has increased. Ms. von Schnurbein and the European Commission also work to combat anti-Semitism outside the EU through joint initiatives with the United States, Canada and Israel, through the United Nations seminars and initiatives, and by organising and participating in high-level conferences on anti-Semitism around the world. So on behalf of Indiana University, I am very pleased to welcome Ms. von Schnurbein to Bloomington as the keynote speaker for this conference on contending with anti-Semitism in a changing political climate. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
President McRobbie, thank you so much for your kind words. Professor Rosenfeld, Provost Robel, dear scholars, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a true honor to be with you. And it's good to be back in the Midwest. I wasn't actually here during university, but I spent a high school year in Fort Zumwalt South High School in St. Peters, Missouri, which was a very special time for me, coming from a very remote place in Bavaria and enjoying the American friendliness and welcoming way of making me enjoy this year as much as possible. And I have very fond memories of my year in the region. My sincere thanks goes to Professor Rosenfeld for the kind invitation and for offering this keynote speech to a representative of the European Union. Anti-Semitism is a transatlantic, if not a global, challenge, and we need to pool all our forces to address it. And in fact, this day, already today, has been very enriching, and I can see that, in fact, Indiana University is a true hub when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism and preparing the theoretical basis for it. I look forward to the inspiration of the coming days at this conference because I strongly believe that in addition to listening closely to the communities directly concerned by our policy making, exchange with scholars and researchers is essential to getting things right. Last year, I spent some time myself at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, to look further into various forms of anti-Semitism and to ensure our policy making addresses all forms of them holistically. I'll share some of the ideas from that time with you in the course of the evening. Researchers, as much as policymakers, face challenges in a world where facts seem to count less than claims and assertions, a world in which statements by public actors offer fertile ground for conspiracy and prejudice. We definitely need more lux and veritas, light and truth, to say it in the spirit of this university, not losing sight of reality and ensuring fact-based policy, rather than policy-based fact-making, is essential. What has this meant, and does it mean for the European Union's action in the fight against anti-Semitism? In the first part of my reflections, I will share with you my analysis of the situation of anti-Semitism in Europe today, as it is perceived by Europeans, Jews and non-Jews alike, looking also at the various forms that are found in Europe today. In the second part of my speech, I will focus on the actions of the European Union, and in particular, the European Commission, its executive arm, have taken to address anti-Semitism both with preventive as well as repressive measures, and explain our next steps. Even though some think that the EU cannot fight anti-Semitism effectively for operational and structural reasons, there has been a lot of progress over the past years, and in particular in 2018. Public administration is like a huge ship. You can shift the course only slowly. But once structures exists, actually things on the ground can change. In my reflections, as was already mentioned by President McRobbie, I will refer to two sets of data that we commissioned in the past year. One is the Fundamental Rights Agency's survey on the perception among European Jews of anti-Semitism. We polled 16,300 Jews across Europe, and the impact it has on their everyday lives. And to match that, we also polled the general population as to their perception of anti-Semitism. There was a discrepancy when it came to the increase, as was already mentioned, and that was published in January 2019. So we have two relatively fresh sets of data that are important tools to ensure that the political leadership across the EU also sees the challenges and the relevance. Both surveys reveal truths that are uncomfortable and call for urgent action, and that was exactly the purpose. Let's start from the beginning, and I give you a bit of a structure on how this position also came about. Following the attack on Charlie Hebdo and Hyper Cacher in Paris, as well as the deadly attack on Dan Uzan guarding the synagogue in Copenhagen 2015, the European Commission recognized the significant increase of attacks and hatred towards Jews, and in a different nature and also different source, also an increase towards hatred of Muslims. This resulted in December 2015 in an appointment of two coordinators, one on anti-Muslim hatred and myself on anti-Semitism, and we work very closely together. As part of my mandate, I've established close contacts with the Jewish communities across Europe. I listen to their concerns and also to their ideas, and then bring them back to the political level of the European Commission, and make sure that the policies that we decide and that I propose are fed into the policy-making process. In addition, a good deal of my work has been to ensure that non-Jewish audiences understand the nexus between anti-Semitism and the state of European democracy today. Jewish life has been present in Europe for over 2 millennia. Europe gave birth to almost all the major Jewish movements, from Reform Judaism to Hasidism, from Zionism to the Bund. Jewish Europeans shaped European development in all areas, with Albert Einstein, I know you claim him too, Gustav Mahler, Benjamin Disraeli or Simone Weil, the first president of the European Parliament and a Holocaust survivor. At the same time, pogroms, the Inquisition, crusades culminated in the Holocaust 80 years ago. Jew hatred has been intrinsic to European DNA and still haunts Europe today. When the new wave of anti-Semitism hit Jewish Europeans in the early 2000s, before the backdrop of 9/11, the anti-racist turned anti-Semitic Durban conference, and the outbreak of the Second Intifada, Jewish Europeans and scholars alike rightly criticized the lack of acknowledgement and state response by European institutions and governments. The anti-Semitic bias of an attack was explained or excused by the social environment of the perpetrator or the Middle East conflict. The denial or blindness of anti-Semitic biases has at least 3 contributing factors, and they are unfortunately not confided to Europe. Firstly, after Auschwitz, in Europe the Holocaust became the new bar for what anti-Semitism is. Anything below racial laws and genocide was belittled, just like the acknowledgement of continuity of anti-Semitism before 1933 and after 1945. When Jews raised concerns, these were often perceived as exaggerated. Instead of stripping ourselves of anti-Semitic prejudices after the Shoah, we added new forms, such as the idea that Jews exploit the Holocaust in their favor. Undue comparisons trivialize or distort the Holocaust in exhibitions like From Auschwitz to Gaza, without wanting to trivialize the extremely difficult situation of the people living in Gaza. The same is true for calls from right-wing populists to draw a line under the continued rehashing of the Shoah, calls for rewriting European history once the last Holocaust survivor has died, because not everything Hitler did was bad. They go hand in hand with the distortion of Holocaust and with revisionism. So, such secondary anti-Semitism seems to me particularly hurtful to the Jewish community, and not only in Europe, because who has not lost somebody in the Shoah? And the worst is probably when the majority remains silent in the face of such expressions. The famous silence of the bystanders. To ensure undistorted research, the European Union has established in 2010 the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, so-called ERI, the largest platform to connect research centers, memorial sites in Europe with Yad Vashem and the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. The EU also acquired last November permanent international partnership with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Secondly, as Eric Ward, the executive director of Western State Center, has pointed out so aptly, Jews found themselves in a situation where they were being defined as white, not only by white society, but also by anti-racist and elements of the political left. We discussed this amply already this morning. Insisting Jews identify as white and therefore privileged no longer allowed a space for a conversation about anti-Semitism. Seeing Jews as white, and even white supremacists, disregards the anti-Semitic slurs coming out of Charlottesville by white supremacists that look like college students, the other way around, as Deborah Lipstadt pointed out in her recent book, Antisemitism Here and Now. After all these worst attacks on Jews in the United States were also committed by a white supremacist. Jews should be allowed, just like any other minority, to define what they perceive as hatred against them. This was made explicitly clear by the Board of Deputies of British Jews in their row with Jeremy Corbyn over the adoption of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. The FRA survey actually, so this survey that we did among European Jews, reveals that the examples of the IRA definition are congruent with what the vast majority in Europe sees as anti-Semitic. With this in mind, the European Commission answered officially in defense of the IRA definition that the European Commission considers that the victim's perspective is an important starting point in the fight against any form of racism and hatred. So the European Commission fully endorsed the definition as a basis of its work and training in January 2017. And it has been defending it publicly and promoting its adoption among EU member states. Thirdly, anti-Semitism is hiding behind anti-Zionism, as we know. It was under the flag of anti-Zionism that anti-Semitism proliferated in communist countries and movements. I will quote you an unusual expert in the field of left-wing anti-Semitism, and I let you guess who it is. So, quote, "Of course we can close our eyes to the facts and limit ourselves to vague generalities about the equality and brotherhood of all races. But an ostrich policy will not advance us a single step. All serious and honest observers bear witness to the existence of anti-Semitism, not only of the old and hereditary, but also of the new Soviet variety." Any guess? It was Leo Trotsky who said this. Communist anti-Zionism drove out tens of thousands of Jews, mostly Holocaust survivors, from Poland in the 1968 purges. Communist anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism locked up and systematically discriminated Jews in the Soviet Union, and anti-Zionism still remains one of the main factors of anti-Semitism on the left today, including increasingly in mainstream society. 1 out of 2 Europeans see Jewish people in their country through the lens of the Middle East conflict. And there's a great variety among the member states. The 3 countries in which this perception is the highest are Sweden with 85%, the Netherlands with 77%, and Germany with 69%. People seeing Jews in their country through the lens of the Middle East conflict. And indeed, according to the FRA survey, Jews encounter most often Israel-related anti-Semitism. 51% say that they hear most often Israelis behave like Nazis. So the opinion of 50% of Europeans on Jews in their country, on average, is in a report to the Middle East conflict. At the same time, one of the most important factors mentioned by Jews when defining their identity is support for Israel. That is, support for the existence of the Jewish state independently of its government. It's a safe haven, a last resort if everything goes wrong in Europe again. There is a lot of confusion around this aspect of Jewish identity in Europe. And First Vice President Timmermans, to whom I report, he stated at the Grand Synagogue in Brussels recently, "The existence of the State of Israel is the ultimate triumph over the attempt to eliminate the Jewish nation. There will now always be a homeland where every Jew is safe." It is important in Europe for political leaders to state this, because when you feel that your identity is endangered, in a certain environment, you start thinking about alternatives before you suffocate. And when Jews have felt the need to leave Europe in the past, it's never been good for Europe. So, anti-Semitism comes today from left, right and center, but the most lethal attacks are committed by radicalized young Muslims, certainly in Western Europe. It is important to acknowledge that anti-Semitic myths, as well as hatred against Israel, are widespread within parts of the immigrant population in Western Europe, up to 2 to 3 times higher than among general population. I deeply believe that they can strip themselves of their prejudices, but only if these prejudices are addressed head-on. It must be understood that the Holocaust is the history of all Europeans, independently of where their parents or grandparents came from. Bridging the knowledge about anti-Semitism today and Holocaust education is thus not only a backward-looking, but very much a forward-looking topic. Accepting Jewish life is a door opener, in fact, for belonging to European society, and no conflict anywhere in the world can justify hatred or violence in Europe. At the same time, we must acknowledge the stigmatization of Muslims in Europe. Far-right politicians in Europe tend to speak about an alleged imported anti-Semitism to hide their own anti-Semitism and racism. By denying their own anti-Semitism, they hope to appeal to people's fears of Europe's culture and well-being being threatened by Muslims and profit from an anti-migrant, anti-Muslim atmosphere. The truth is, as I tried to explain, all forms of anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial and trivialization, and anti-Zionism and conspiracy theories can be found in Europe, and they have been there long before a majority of Muslims, important Muslim community came to Europe. And there's another aspect that we often discuss, especially with Jewish student organizations that engage in coalition building. European Jews do not want to be used for bashing of other minorities. They recognize the anti-Semitism coming from within Muslim communities. However, they also acknowledge the hatred towards Muslims. Yes, Jews ascribe 1/3 of anti-Semitic incidents to Muslims, according to our survey. However, for example, in France, 93% of Jews see anti-Muslim hatred as a major problem as well, and 9 out of 10 Hungarians and Polish Jews also perceive an increase of anti-Muslim hatred. I would say that's anti-Muslim hatred without Muslims. In my analysis, I focus on anti-Semitism that has developed not despite of Auschwitz, but because of it. There are several other forms, including the anti-Semitism fueled by Christian replacement theology, racism, and conspiracy theories that led to the Shoah. But all those forms shall be subsumed into a short exchange between 2 bikers. So, 2 bikers meet. Says one to the other, "You know, bikers and Jews rule the world." Says the other biker, perplexed, "Why bikers?" So I come to the second part of my speech, which I call From Denial to Action. I'll give you snapshots of political initiatives and policy measures taken over the past 3 years to prevent and combat the various forms of anti-Semitism. Today, Europe is the homeland to around 1.5 million Jews. Among 500 million Europeans, this number is tiny. But Jewish history and culture has always been intrinsically linked with Europe. Europe was thriving when the Jewish community was thriving. Europe suffered when its Jewish community suffered. And Europe destroyed itself when it destroyed its Jewish community. And so what we say today, when we say today that the many recent attacks on Jews in Europe have been attacks on all of us, these are not empty words. Europeans increasingly understand this. Today, 50% of Europeans see anti-Semitism as a problem in their country. The perception differs significantly among member states again. The highest perception is in Sweden, again 81%, in France 72%, and in Germany 66%. There is certainly a difference to the 85% of European Jews stating that anti-Semitism is their concern number one. But the perception gap, to some extent, is also to be explained by the fact that people who are directly concerned by hatred perceive it also more directly. I dare say also that there is a change ongoing in the way politicians and public actors see anti-Semitism, certainly in the center of the political spectrum. We acknowledge the essential link between upholding European values, preserving the European integration process, and protecting a vibrant Jewish life in Europe. European elections are just around the corner in May this year, and many fear an increase of parties on the left and right fringes of the political spectrum in the next parliament. Recently, the fight against anti-Semitism has become part of the election campaign. The lead candidate of the center-right European People's Party, Manfred Weber, announced strong action against anti-Semitism should he be elected to the European Commission as president. And you may think that this is normal, but actually this is quite a step to make such an announcement as part of an election campaign. At this year's International Holocaust Remembrance Day, Jean-Claude Juncker, the current president of the European Commission, highlighted in particular the link between the European Union and anti-Semitism. And he said, I quote, "Our union was built on the ashes of the Holocaust. Remembering it and fighting anti-Semitism today is our duty towards the Jewish community and indispensable to protect our common European values." European integration was a direct response to 2 world wars and the crime of the Holocaust. The European Union has been the guarantor of peace, of the longest period of peace, in fact, on the continent. And the resurgence of open anti-Semitism is thus seen with great worry. The current forces acting against the European project and praising the allegedly glorious past of their nation states have forgotten the true fate of nation states in Europe. Timothy Snyder was recently at the European Parliament, and he said, "The populist and nationalist idea that we can do away with the European Union and return to a nation state is not only dangerous to Jews, it's dangerous for everyone. There is no moment in European history when a nation state was good for Jews. There is also not any moment of European history when the nation state was effective for anyone. There is no return to the nation state. You had a Europe of empire, and now you have a Europe of integration." Anti-Jewish and anti-EU sentiments are proliferating in Europe hand in hand. Europe is challenged when state actors fuel conspiracy in the so-called, for example, Soros campaign in Hungary, when the Prime Minister talks about people who, and I quote, "are not national but international, who do not believe in work but speculate with money, who have no homeland but feel that the whole world is theirs." Such tropes must be condemned immediately, especially also by non-Jews. And so we called out this dog whistle anti-Semitism in the strongest terms. Now let me show you a few policy actions, and I would like to describe the process of the IRA definition and the adoption of it. Because probably the first thing I realized when I was appointed in December 2015 was that you cannot fight it if you can't define it. The path of this non-legally binding working definition from a red rag without a status in 2015 to becoming the benchmark for being serious about the fight against anti-Semitism in 2018 stands exemplary for the change of attitude among European political actors in their recognition that anti-Semitism is a challenge that goes far beyond the Jewish community. In 2015, there was a clear expectation from the side of the Jewish community to recognize the working definition on anti-Semitism. Thus, in the first meeting that I held in Prague in January 2016 with all the special envoys from around the globe, basically, from the EU, from Israel, from the US, and also international organizations, including the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, we discussed the usefulness and the use of that definition. In what can be considered a speed of light process by standards of international organizations, that definition was adopted by the IRA under the Romanian presidency only 5 months later. Following then the endorsement by the European Commission in January 2017, the European Parliament adopted it in a resolution on anti-Semitism, and finally all 28 member states endorsed it on the 6th of December 2018. And increasingly, since 2016, individual member states are also adopting this decision, this definition. Several other entities have also adopted it in the meantime, and so within 3 years, using this definition has become the expression of a country, of a city, of an institution, of a university, a party, and sports clubs, as an expression that they are fighting anti-Semitism in a serious way. And we saw what happened when the British Labour Party decided last year to adopt the definition only in parts. In the wake of recent anti-Semitic acts coming from all sides in France, even President Macron announced its adoption in February. And this is a very positive step and gives good reasons also for Sweden, Denmark, and Ireland and others to follow suit. Having said all this, adoption can only be the first step. It is much more important to actually use this non-legally binding tool in training for law enforcement agencies, for teachers, and for the media. Estonia, for example, has not formally adopted the definition, but it uses it in its police training. When it comes to the fight against anti-Semitism, the word is probably our strongest weapon. Anti-Semitic speech must be contradicted at once. It's easy for the far left to criticize the far right, and for the right to point to the Muslims, and for the Muslims to blame Israel, and for Israel to blame Europe. In reality, obviously, it's much more difficult, but it's also much more effective to address anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry in one's own environment, one's own party, one's own coalition, one's own sport club, and at any dinner party. And here, this IRA definition can be useful. Before I explain the other EU policy measures, allow me to share a few thoughts which I compiled during my fellowship in Florence, humbly aware that the density of academic knowledge of Judaism, the Holocaust, and contemporary anti-Semitism can hardly get higher than in this room. The truth is that many of these ideas have already flown into this declaration on combating anti-Semitism. And given the current resurgence of anti-Semitism, I have heard too often from members of the Jewish community, "I will stay, but I tell my children, leave." So it is clear that we have to ensure that Jews see a future for themselves in Europe. You may remember that as a result of the banking crisis in 2008, banks had to introduce stress tests to prove their viability. So I thought, how about a stress test for public entities that exposes the most burning issues and reveals their strengths and flaws in the fight against anti-Semitism? This may help countries to address the weaknesses and also put their money where their mouth is. I am a so-called Brussels bureaucrat, after all, so STRESS is of course an acronym. It stands for security, trust, recognition, education, societal cohesion, and strategy. You remember? So, security. Jews must feel safe. The physical threat to Jews remains imminent, especially in Western Europe. In some countries, Jewish communities spend up to 50% of their budget on security measures. But security is a prime responsibility of the state, and we would not ask that of any other community. Thus, public authorities must ensure the security of Jewish premises based on joint risk assessment between law enforcement authorities and Jewish communities, and the costs must not be borne by the community. The second aspect is trust. A long-term prospect for the Jewish community in Europe will have to be built on mutual trust between Jewish community and state authorities. Jews must be able to regard the state as an ally, as a protector of their livelihood. But at the moment, 70% of Jews are of the opinion that their government does not fight anti-Semitism effectively. To give a real example, when a Jewish student was harassed at a Berlin school by his Muslim peers, the headmaster shrugged his shoulder and said, "You know, there is a Middle East conflict going on. No wonder this plays out here." The state must always side with the victim and refrain from victim blaming. The R stands for recognition. In order to eradicate anti-Semitism and all its forms of anti-Semitism need to be acknowledged as equally pernicious. A prerequisite is acknowledging Jewish identity in its complexity, which includes Holocaust remembrance and support for the existence of the State of Israel. The IRA definition of anti-Semitism is a solid basis that should be used. E for education. Formal and informal education remains the most important preventive and long-term instrument against anti-Semitism and all other forms of biases. The school remains the place, and often the only place, where biases are actively addressed. It is thus essential to ensure a holistic approach to teaching about Jewish history and culture, as well as the Holocaust and contemporary anti-Semitism. The first S stands for societal cohesion. Acceptance of Jewish life in all its diversity is a sign for a healthy society. It should also become a benchmark for successful integration, and thus learning about Jewish life, the Holocaust, and anti-Semitism in Europe should be made part of integration instruments for newcomers. This will start with sensitizing the social workers that are in touch with these newcomers. And the last S stands for strategy. Provided there is a strong political will to push back anti-Semitism, the EU institutions, together with the national governments, should develop holistic strategies. This has to include reaching out to mayors, to unions, to sports clubs, and it needs regular monitoring and adoption of measures on European level to support this process and to ensure that it goes forward. So much in a snapshot, this stress test. Rather than reinventing the wheel, we think that when it comes to instruments, the European Commission and other international actors can support this process by providing tools and best practices. For example, the human rights arm of the OSCE has published and is implementing guidance tools for security of Jewish premises, already adapted to different EU countries. They have also published guidance to addressing anti-Semitism in education. There are many tools that are underused, but it all starts with a critical self-analysis by the governments, and here such a stress test could help. On 6 December 2018, the 28 EU member states adopted by unanimity the aforementioned definition on anti-Semitism under the Austrian EU presidency. This document will in fact form the basis for our work in the years to come. In it, member states agreed 17 policy measures where they commit to ensuring the security of Jewish communities and providing the finances. They call upon themselves to endorse this IHRA definition, to promote Holocaust education as well as the role of Jewish community in Europe today, including also in integration measures, and to address hate speech online, and finally to adopt and implement holistic strategies on all forms of anti-Semitism. However, the most important message of this document was probably not even written in it, and that is that the European Union sides with its Jewish population. But of course, a declaration is not worth the paper on which it is written unless tangible change happens on the ground. Well aware that the responsibilities for much of what needs to happen now, like in the police, in the judiciary, in education, are with member states rather than with the European level, Commissioner Jourova for Justice, she announced in January the creation of a working group with all EU member states to ensure that the pledges made in this declaration will transfer into action and structures. And so we come to the next steps. The aim is for all member states to adopt these holistic strategies on anti-Semitism within their general strategies against racism and xenophobia by the end of 2020. The European Commission will facilitate the process and nudge member states to accelerate this process. Earlier this week, we already had the first informal meeting with EU member states and agreed the process and the next steps. In the framework of 1.5 years, the working group will address all the elements of this declaration. And the first official meeting will bring together the Jewish community leaders, the relevant NGOs, as well as all member states in June of this year to discuss security. And currently we are collecting from the Jewish communities the information on how the situation actually is with regards to security, whether there have been risk assessments, whether they have to put money in themselves, how much in percentage of their budget goes into it, and so on. That will be the basis to discuss with member states what they can do individually. We will then continue in the fall with a similar exercise on education and training on the Holocaust remembrance as well as integration measures, and finally, in the spring of next year, the data collection and the IHRA definition. And all of that should then lead into the presentation by each member state of their strategies at the end of 2020. Finally, a particular concern has been the explosion of cyber hate and anti-Semitism online. In fact, 9 out of 10 Jews say that the internet is the place where they experience anti-Semitism the most. In May 2016, the European Commission concluded a code of conduct with Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft and Google, and more have joined since, like Instagram and Snapshot, to revise and, if necessarily, take down within 24 hours notified content that is illegal under European law. That is, for example, incitement to hatred and violence or Holocaust denial. As you know, European law, due to our history, is very different when it comes to freedom of speech in comparison to the US. When we started in 2016, only 28% of flagged content was removed, and today we are at 75%. Our initiatives come out of the understanding that hate crime often starts with hate speech. So in addition, online perpetrators need to be brought to court, because what's illegal offline is also illegal online. And finally, the platforms themselves have to take more responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, the guiding star of all our actions, as President McRobbie already mentioned, has been to achieve normality for Jewish life in Europe. As much as we may need security measures at the moment, our ultimate goal for Jewish Europeans is for them to make the same life choices as any other citizen, irrespective of security concerns and in full respect of their identity. But we need a long breath. Antisemitism has been around for 2,000 years. Sometimes I feel we are like Don Quixote fighting against windmills. Every new generation has to be raised and educated, committed to our common history, and take responsibility that never again indeed happens. It will take time and a lot of effort until the change will be tangible for Jewish communities. But the political will to act is increasing, and measures are being put into place all across Europe. So my hope is that when we hold our next survey 5 to 6 years down the road, we will see less fear and more trust among European Jews in their future in Europe, because defending Jewish life in Europe, in the end, means defending Europe's open and liberal democracy. Thank you very much.
What an inspiring speech we were just given. Wonderful, thank you, thank you. Our speaker has graciously agreed to entertain a few questions. The floor is now open. I'll be glad to monitor any questions you may have. Just raise your hand and we will get started. Rabbi Besser.
Thank you so much. What is the influence or effect of Brexit on the EU's, what is the influence of Brexit on the EU's fight against anti-Semitism?
Well, when you ask what is the influence of Brexit on the rise of hatred and anti-Semitism, I think it's quite evident. It's very negative, and it has also, in a way, a spillover effect. We see increasing tensions in various EU countries. But with regards to the fight against anti-Semitism, in many regards, the UK has always been in the front. For example, the UK police used the IRA definition long before the government had adopted it. So we can learn a lot, and I hope that there will be possibility to continue the exchange. Britain has also been very good when it comes to coalition building, for example, between the Jewish community and the Muslim community. You know, there are things that have been important, and this exchange and conversation with the UK has always been enriching. So, in any case, Brexit is difficult, I think, for Europe as much as for the UK, and we will see in how far we will be able to continue the exchanges and the exchange of good practices also after Brexit.
Yes. Please. As loud as you can, please.
There's a
Ah, sure.
Could you say a few words about this organization called this Movement and about the float they had in the parade? I have no idea why they
So the lady is referring to a recent parade during Carnival in a small Belgian town called Aalst, where puppets of Orthodox Jews wearing big hats with big noses, big ears, a sack of money, and yeah, I think this is about all features. In pink coats were put on a wagon and paraded the streets of this small town. This carnival has been listed on the UNESCO Heritage List, and as you can imagine, there was an outcry at the fact that they were able to be part of this parade and no one stopped them. And I think I've said it before, the chutzpah they had to even do this, you know, and knowing that no one would stop them is very worrying. Now, it's the responsibility of each member state to follow up on such incitement and hatred. Belgium is taking it up. There is an equality body that is looking into this matter. We have been very clear on the day, as a European Commission, on the day after it happened, that it is unthinkable that 74 years after the Holocaust such puppets could be part of any parade. And as you can imagine, also within UNESCO there are debates about whether such a parade deserves the label of heritage registered event. There's a lady there.
If I may only to say about us,
Yes.
Carnival, unfortunately, the Center Against Racism said it was just a normal transgression, and they decided not to go to court. So it's finished for the Belgians. Unfortunately, we are not well defended.
We'll see.
Very short question. In Poland nowadays you have in official state media and apparatus an increasing number of statements blaming Jews for the Holocaust. Is there anything practical that your office can do in order to intervene in this situation?
Well, you know that with regards to Poland, there are many issues that the Commission has raised. There is for those who are maybe not following the issue so closely, there is a procedure, actually the first ever procedure under so-called Article 50, opened against Poland because of their constitutional court. So there are many issues that we are currently raising with the Polish authorities. I'm not sure whether it would be productive from our side to raise these issues. However, what I'm happy to discuss is to see in how far we can support the Jewish community with regards to resilience, yeah? Because it is something that, you know, it's really within the member states' remedy, and member states are very sensitive when the Commission comes in as the Messiah. So we have to be careful, but it is something. I mean, we are also in touch, of course, with the leadership of the Jewish community to support them where we can. But it's not something that we can remedy, unfortunately, immediately.
Sadly, the situation is international, and with Steve O'Bannon going to Europe or Italy or wherever he has gone, I'm curious about what the international anti-Semitic organizations are, who's supporting them, who is researching all this, and is this a place to go to try to stop some of the buildup of the hate propaganda and the effective coalition that the white supremacists are building?
Do you have something on research?
Yes, lots of research is going on, including right here in Bloomington. And the address you just heard now is a keynote address for a major international scholars conference. So in the room tonight, there are a number of people working hard and well on these issues. It takes time, but nonetheless, we can come to understand things a lot more deeply as we gather, talk, discuss, and do more and more thinking about all of this. Our work is not political, it's scholarly and intellectual. On the other hand, as you can tell from tonight, we're more than happy to collaborate with people in the field doing the work.
I think there are several aspects to it. I mean, first of all, you have the social networks where, in former times you had two bigots meeting over a beer in a mountainous area, and when the evening was over, they had a hangover and that was it. Now they can actually organize themselves via social media and create a movement. And so we see that it's not only the white supremacists, it's the white supremacists siding with far left people over certain issues. It's also across the different groups that we see coalitions being forged. So I think one important aspect will be in the future with regards to social media. I mean, as I said, we already have a code of conduct with regards to takedown when things are illegal, but but they need to be flagged. And flagging is not something not the majority of content is flagged. So the takedown, while the rate has improved significantly, Günther, you're always in my way and seeing the lady. So while it has improved significantly, it's only a very small portion. This is one aspect. The other aspect is, of course, with regards to the responsibility of the companies themselves not to become platforms of hatred. And that is something that, as European Union, we are definitely also considering what kind of action we need. Already Germany has created a law, but this is only Germany. And when things are being blocked, or when things are being evaluated, then it's a geo-blocking. So at the moment, we have the blocking and the takedowns for the whole of the European Union, and then you have Germany, who also on top of it gives certain fines for certain content if it's not removed. Now France is thinking about having a similar law. So I could imagine that when we have too many countries doing these things on their own, that there will be a political will to say, well then, like we have the code of conduct and therefore have more weight for Europe as a whole, this should be considered. However, there are many aspects involved also when it comes then to reaching the perpetrators, because as I said, you have to take the perpetrators to court as well. If someone publicly incites offline, he can be taken to court, and the same law applies for the online world. So to find these people, as you also know probably, is not easy. Sometimes the addresses are actually in the United States. You have to ask to get the information, and the laws are very different here in the US than in Europe. So just to say, it's not an answer, I know, but to say there are many elements that need to be considered, and we are considering them, but it's also a long-term process. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have attended this conference in small bits over the past 3 conferences, and I remember at one of the first, one scholar said, I am afraid we have been asleep at the wheel. And that has stayed with me, knowing that what comes from these conferences is often what I find myself using as a practitioner, as a professional in the Jewish community, combating anti-Semitism in high schools and college campuses. What I learned here helps me a couple years down the road. And I'm wondering if you could share a few thoughts on whether you think, looking back, the EU should have created your position 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and knowing that the United States is behind and what's coming out of Europe, and getting on top of these things, what can we do now to try not to be a little bit asleep at the wheel and learn from what you're doing in Europe?
Well, I think one thing you learn in your political career that you never engage in what if. So I do think that there has been a recognition that it is high time to act, and I have seen in the past 3 years a significant acceleration also of the willingness to act, and this declaration that was adopted is a concrete outcome of this. The United States has just recently appointed a special envoy on anti-Semitism. However, he deals with anti-Semitism in the world, so he will be monitoring Europe and report to the State Department. We will work closely together. When it comes to the U.S. inside, I think probably the same instruments that we are trying now to apply in Europe will also apply here. I mean, the long-term arm is education. But one thing where I think we can learn from the US is the civil society resilience to speak up when you see anti-Semitism. So Europe doesn't have a very good record of civil courage, unfortunately. And this is something we are trying to foster and we're trying to build up, because in the end it's the counter speech that will put the anti-Semite in its place, together with other measures, of course. Yeah? But I think this is very important. Another thing that I've also seen when it comes to interaction between the institutions and the Jewish communities is it's good when they are united. It helps, it gives them more clout. Although it's difficult, but to try to overcome differences that may be of all different kinds of natures, and in the end, when it comes to anti-Semitism, I think that there is a similar goal across all Jewish communities. So in the interaction with the institutions, to show unity is also very important. And then the other aspect, I think you can expect of your institutions to speak up against anti-Semitism. So we are increasingly doing this. Of course, it's not for the European Commission to call out every single act in every member state. That's not possible, but to ensure that it is done and to support also those who can do it, I think that's something that we can do.
Let me say that Katharina von Schnurbein's day began 13 hours ago, and all of us in the conference have been going at it over. We'll have just one more question. Dina Burrow. Our speaker is more generous than I am. She said we can take 2.
No, because I saw that Philip had also.
First of all, thank you so much, and not only for your speech tonight, but for all your work. The work that you are doing relentlessly, diligently. You're in touch with your center. You created a certain center from which you are in touch with so many institutes, and I really, I think all of us would like to thank you for what you're doing. That's first important. And let me ask you the following. The lady was asking about research of anti-Semitism. We researchers and analysts of the situation for many years find it, I think along the years, that the main problem is to be precise, to precisely assess the situation. Not to minimize it, certainly not, but also not to overdo or to exaggerate, even in the face of reality that around you says it's on the rise. The situation is terrible. It has never been so since World War II, Gewalt. Okay? So, being precise and facing really pressures is our main goal. And in that regard, I'd like to ask you the following. There has been recently a host of surveys, each more important and encompassing more people than the others. The FRA, some 6,000 people were...
16.
60, oh. And then there was the CNN, 7,000 or something. And then was yours, Eurobarometer, 23,000. And there are a host of others. It's an important tool in assessing the situation. But isn't it possible that surveys both reflect the situation, but also create a situation, because they add to this general atmosphere of Gewalt?
Yes, well, we are aware, of course, of this argument. I think that it was very important that actually, for the first time in the existence of the European Union, we did a survey on the perception of the general population on anti-Semitism. It was important. Why? Because we needed to show to member states how the situation is in their country. And it's very important, and I said that before, the fact-based policy making, this is part of it. And I have to say, to me, the outcome of the survey was not such a surprise, but it is also because I'm in touch with the Jewish community, so much of the FRA survey was known to me. But I think you need to be able to, again, show to the countries how the Jewish community in their country view the situation. I agree that one shouldn't, there shouldn't be a proliferation of surveys, and actually they can also tell us only so and so much. I have already had several responses now from member states who say we are acting because of the studies. Because when you have a certain media resonance also, it creates also pressure for member states to act in their countries. And therefore, at the moment we needed these tools. Anyway, it will be for the FRA another 6 years until it will be repeated, and hopefully the results will be more positive. But I strongly believe in this, in the fact that you need to show to the political actors how the situation is. They are not going to just do it on the basis of a memorandum. Yeah. Philip, yeah.
Okay, thank you for your patience. But also I wanted to say thank you for coming and giving that talk. Because I think the bottom line of all of this, would be very difficult. I can imagine what giving a talk like this must be. But what I will say is I think you said two really, really important things. One is that you want that we should pay attention to what Jews think and feel. And the second is that you connected a sense of what Europe is, was and could be to the fate of Jews. And those are two really profound And they set a framework. That's all you can do, really, is set a normative framework within which the rest of us have to work. And that is tremendously encouraging to me, but also worrying to me. And I'll say why it's worrying and then say why it's encouraging. It's worrying because we might be leaving this normative framework in Britain. And I think that in both of those respects, because we have in Britain had a debate about Brexit and about anti-Semitism, in which what Jews feel is often not taken seriously, and in which the normative basis of the EU, the normative, the ethical, the moral basis of the EU, hasn't been a factor in the discussion at all. So if we leave that normative framework. And that means that if we do leave, those of us who have to fight outside it have to reassert that normative framework in the way that we do, and hope that you carry on doing it while we've left it. So I want to say that I think those two things are of absolutely fundamental importance. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and I wish you a good night.